Introductions are just generally a pain to write, and I'm going to show you how to write an introduction for your research classes. Really, this will work for most classes, but in general, how do you write a paper after you've done the research, and how do you do it quickly? My advice is that you should always use a model paper. So our model paper that I'm using, at least for the intro piece, is a paper called Walking in Her Shoes, Pretending to be a Female Role Model Increases Young Girls' Persistence in Science. I chose it because it's cool science, number one. Number two, it was all over the media. And number three, I think they have a really good use of the gap style paper. So the gap style paper is pretty simple. It starts with a quote in our example. We're going to use a quote. It has, because our model did, we're going to have the hypothesis foreshadowing paragraph, which is really like hard for students to wrap their head around. The whole goal of the first paragraph is to foreshadow your hypothesis. That is, let readers start thinking about it so that you can convince them it's correct. In fact, the whole point of this paper is to convince your reader that your hypothesis is likely correct without convincing them that your work has already been done. So how do you do that? Well, you got to start with the hypothesis foreshadowing. You got to go to the problem in the world, the problem in the problem like in the world is how I think about it. Like, what problem are you trying to solve? What problem are you trying to understand? Could be a problem of like social justice, which this one is, or it could just be a problem of just general, like, we want to understand reading better. The gap paragraph tells you the gap in the literature. That is, what have we not done as a field? It's pointing out like a flaw in the field. So that's the most important paragraph. The second most important paragraph is you make a case that the hypothesis fills the gap. And then finally, you provide just a quick methods overview saying how you're going to test the idea. So if this is true, this intro paragraph is essentially a 5-paragraph essay, but not the 5-paragraph essays you learned in high school. Now, we're going to write our paper in reverse. So you're actually going to start with the methods overview. Why? Because that's the simplest. You know your IVs and DVs. If you don't by now, I don't know what else to do. Come see me in office hours, okay? But you start there because that's the most concrete, right? That's like your starting point. That's your goal, is to suggest that we're going to use this method to test this hypothesis, to fill this gap, to solve this problem, right? That's related to these real world concerns. So you can see how it works. We're going to use this method, right, to test this hypothesis that we think fills this gap, that examines this problem that we care about. And when we start the paper, we tell you we're going to do this. All right, that's it. All right, so you do that too. That's all you need. You do this, you're on the right organizational track. So your first paragraph is the methods overview paragraph. This tells the readers what's going to happen in the method without telling them all the details they need to make it happen. So you can look at this whole paragraph and read it. Actually, I want you to pause the video now and read this paragraph. So pause. All right, I'm assuming you are unpaused and we are back. Now, this is a very complicated paragraph for undergrads. This is the only paragraph that I think is too complicated for undergrads, but this is a paragraph written by pros. I think they had some reviewers ask them to talk about some of their other DVs, or they just wanted to talk in their non-primary dependent variables. So if you read that, I have the sentence breakdown on the left. The first sentence introduces the main dependent variable and the overarching idea of the study. So the general overarching principle of the study is presented in the first sentence. So it's like, in sum, this study tested a novel and breach approach to promote girls' persistence in science by encouraging them to assume the identity of a successful female scientist. That's kind of like the take home, right? That's the take home of the method, but it's the bigger picture. It's like we're using this intervention to improve persistence. So it's like describing your IV-DV relationship in a very specific way that promotes your method as valuable. Then their second sentence, you can really skip it. It talks about a new concept. That they want to use in their independent variable. For all of you, your IV should be explained to some degree. Now, if you do have a new concept in your IV that you're bringing up in the last paragraph of your intro, this is how you do it. Most of my students don't need to do that. So the second sentence doesn't matter. They also, if you look at the third sentence, it's really great because they do this mini gap in the literature. So they get the gap out there and fill it real quickly. So they've done everything we've done for this new concept in one sentence, just to show you how important gaps are. But we don't need this either, unless you're filling another mini gap with your study in the last paragraph, which I do not recommend. In the next sentence, they talk about all three of their independent variable conditions. You need to do this. This is setting your reader up to understand your method. Well, in order to do that, they have to understand your independent variable, right? They also talk about the DV throughout. They then introduced a second DV, made a case for it. We don't have to do that unless you're adding a second DV. You see what I'm saying? And then finally, they make a prediction. Let me read those last two sentences you need to include. Well, actually, let me just read the whole thing. In sum, this study tested a novel and breach approach to promote girls' persistence in science by encouraging them to assume the identity of a successful female scientist. So in sum, what is your research trying to accomplish? That's your first sentence. What are you trying to accomplish? Your second sentence is, you don't need therefore, you just write we, because therefore is linked to a whole bunch of other stuff, but you're just like, oh, we contrasted baseline persistence in a science task with their persistence during pretend play, as well as with a condition in which girls were exposed to the same role model with the same growth mindset messages, but were not asked to pretend their exposure condition. And then finally, you just present your prediction. If the effects of pretending are specific to increasing motivation for science, then it should influence persistence above baseline and do so more than mere exposure to role models with growth mindset messages. You're making a prediction there. That's it. That's all you have to do. So I did actually want to add this second DV. So you're going to have to add for your second DV in a secondary outcome of interest. We assess children's self-efficacy in science, given that self-efficacy shapes motivation and predicts gender gaps in representation. So what you're going to need there is a reason. You need a reason for your second DV, in this case, self-efficacy, right? Because self-efficacy shapes the DV and predicts the problem. Right? So you go back to your problem. You need to make an argument. You might have to make a 2 or 3 sentence argument, but we're going to add this to this paper. Then we're going to be done. We got our 1 IV, our 2 DVs, our secondary DV. We've now handled this and we are done. So you're going to choose 1 DV to be the main one you're interested in and a second one to not. Now, some people's DVs are going to be like attempts made, attempts taken, attempts made. Like that's totally fine. Like figure that out, right? But I want you to add your second DV in this way in a secondary outcome of interest. Secondary means it's not as important. I want you to model this sentence too. Now, because we have 2 DVs. When I was originally recording this, I didn't think that, but now we're all good. So ultimately, your job is simple. You're going to emulate the sentence on the right for your specific experiment. In sum, this study tested a novel and brief approach to promote girls' persistence in science by encouraging them to assume the identity of a successful female scientist. So what you need to do is translate this to your own problem. In conclusion, this experiment examined how actively taking empathy for patients impacts racial bias in pain treatment. You can see here that I'm starting with a tag like that. Oh, it's almost over tag. In sum, in conclusion. In conclusion, what? This study, this experiment. What did it do? It tested or it examined what? A novel and brief approach to promote girls' persistence in science, right? Or examined how actively taking empathy for patients, right? What does it do? What do they do? By encouraging them to see the identity of a female scientist, to promote girls' persistence, to examine the impacts on racial bias in pain treatment, right? You can see what happens here. Now, if you have a more complicated study, you have to talk about kind of both your independent variables here to some degree, right? But in some, this study tested a novel and brief approach to promote girls' persistence in science by encouraging them to assume the identity of a successful female scientist. That's one IV being discussed right there. If you had a second one, you'd say, and examining how the second IV like interacts with it. But for research methods 1, we only have one IV. For research methods 2, we will have 2 IVs. So you have to be a little bit more wordy than this study right here. But I want you to pause right now and record. Well, I'm sorry. I want you to pause the recording and write down your first sentence of your last paragraph. So pause now and restart the video when ready. We have another sentence for you to emulate. Therefore, another tag, we contrasted children's baseline persistence in a science task. Look at how they use the parentheses, nice writing move, with their persistence during pretend play, right? Another parentheses defining the experiment, as well as with the condition in which girls were exposed to the same role model with the same growth mindset messages, but were not asked to pretend. All this sentence is doing is saying, what groups are you going to compare? So if you have a 2-group experiment, like my research methods 1 students do, this is pretty easy. If you have a more advanced experiment, like my research methods 2 experiment, you're going to have to work in your second independent variable here. But ultimately, you're going to talk about your different conditions and your different variables. What are you comparing? What are you contrasting? So think about that. Now your job is simply to emulate this work in your own words. So you can see my example to the left. In this experiment, we compared versus we contrasted racial bias in both the empathetic response and pain treatment decisions of novices. Theirs was of children who were trying to take the perspective of virtual patients with the empathetic response and pain treatment decisions of novices who are simply trying to make their best pain treatment decisions for their patients. You can see there I'm just talking about what groups I'm comparing and contrasting, right? You might have something like a continuous second independent variable. Oh, we are comparing how, participants in the control condition, differ from participants in the experimental condition while also accounting for extroversion or something like that. But ultimately, your job is to talk about what are you going to compare and contrast in your analysis here. So follow this model, write your own sentence. Pause the video now. Our final sentence, this is only a 3-sentence paragraph, is just stating your hypothesis. If the effects of pretending are specific to increasing motivation for science, then it should influence persistence above baseline and do so more than mere exposure to role models with growth mindset messages, right? So they're kind of presenting their hypothesis as an if it works statement, which is great. I do the same thing on the left. If empathy reduces racial bias in pain treatment, then we should observe reduced racial biases for novices and healthcare professionals. I ran 3 studies, so that's why I put that. Engaged in empathetic perspective taking while simultaneously observing racial biases in individuals who are simply trying to make their best treatment decisions, right? I'm laying out my hypotheses here. Research methods 1, you have 1 hypothesis. Research methods 2 students, you may have up to 3 hypotheses. So I want you to think about that. And I want you to emulate this in your own work. Pause this now, write your 3rd sentence, finish your paragraph. Now, this is, in my opinion, the most important paragraph in your intro. It's the case. It's the case for your hypothesis, right? So this is like you're making the case here. Now, I'm not going to read this paragraph to you. You should read it. But everything in here is a piece of evidence. Some of the things I am going to point out, because I will read it later. But look at how we cite things in the field. Do we just cite one thing? Do we describe the studies in depth? No, we don't. We get the points there. So let me just go through the case here. Pretend play is common in humans. Pretend play adds others' qualities to the self-concept and impacts our behaviors. Pretend play impacts persistence on difficult tasks. That's really important. Pretend play allows one to deal with stress a little bit better. And thus, I think I have a pretty good case that pretend play may increase persistence for girls when they are experiencing stereotypes, which is implied that it's stressful and shitty and all that stuff, right? Do you buy their case? I sure do, right? That's your job. So if you look, you end with your hypothesis and you present the data that build your case. Does it completely build the case? Is the case proven before they did the experiment? No, it's just possible that it may work. Right? In fact, I would argue that you don't want the evidence to directly lead to your case because that means your work has already been done. So here, when you look at the case, pretend play is common. That's a very general statement. Pretend play impacts the self. It's less general. It's more specific, but it's still general. We're talking about the self concept. Then they go right into pretend play impacts persistence on difficult tasks. That's very relevant to what they're suggesting. And then finally, they end up with pretend play impacts stress. This is also very relevant. Actually, those last 2 points are super relevant, that it allows them to make their case. So when they finally make their case, they're stating their hypothesis, right? But they're saying, hey, this should help improve girls' persistence during a stressful situation. That's what they're saying. And so when you're organizing your evidence, you go from the general to the more specific. What's more relevant and directly associated with your hypothesis? That should be at the end of the paragraph. The more general stuff should be at the beginning. Now, I'm not reading all these sentences to you like last time. I'm going to let you read it. You can pause and read in between my sentences, okay? But the first sentence just says the IV for this specific population leads to changes in the DV, right? That's all it does. The second sentence, when this specific population does the IV, it leads to changes in DV1 and DV2. The third sentence, researchers that I admire, when examining this population who experience this IV condition, have this DV experience relative to the other IV condition. Do you see a pattern? This IV on this population leads to changes in 2 different DVs in this specific environment. Thus, this new IV that we're making should impact this specific population, particularly this DV in this specific environment. Right? Do you see a pattern here? Describe the IV, describe the DV. Sometimes describe the population. It's very important in this paper. It's on kids. You don't always have to do that. And sometimes describe the environment. Didn't always happen, right? But if you notice, this is how we present evidence. And look at the citations. You can't have, none of these sentences don't have a citation. Every one of these sentences have a citation with the exception of the last one, which is their idea. Do the same for your work. Pause this now and write your entire second paragraph using your evidence and IV to DV relationship patterns. Now, the next paragraph you're going to write is the gap paragraph. The gap is essentially saying, hey, other science has done this, but it should have, right? So this is really interesting. This one right here, pause and read this paragraph, and then read that. When you're done, unpause. Did you pause? All right, now I'm coming back. Now that you've read this paragraph, it starts with a hypothesis foreshadow. You can do that too. It then goes to a methods foreshadow, right? There's one rule of writing. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them. So a lot of the times, this repetition style is what we do. They are going to sell this hypothesis throughout this intro. And you see the hypothesis doesn't just show up in one place. No. They're guiding their reader to accept the hypothesis by repeating it a lot. So that's really good. The methods foreshadowing. I mean, that's the whole point of the paper. The methods are important. They're arts. They do that as well. So foreshadow your hypothesis, foreshadow your methods. Then you get another population. This one's a vague DV from the IV, right? Another piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence, population with this specific IV has a difference in the DV. Look at how we talk about evidence. But there's a problem with our current best intervention, current best thing. However, my IV leads to this mediator in the middle and this vague DV. And really what you don't see here is, however, my IV, my new intervention can fix the problems with the old one. That's what's going on here. So you got to do the same thing. The present study focuses on the role of pretend play in promoting 4 to 7-year-old children's, especially girls, persistence in science. One thing I just want to say is when I see a cool writing move, I note it, take note of it. You know, I always put 2 commas to separate especially girls in that sentence. I love how they used hyphens. It was cool. I see it got published. I can do it too. So your job is to emulate this sentence. I did it this way. The present study focuses on the role of empathy in reducing racial bias in pain treatment decisions. Now it's your turn. What does your present study do? Pause this PowerPoint and write your sentence. So we got another methods overview, specifically explored whether encouraging girls and boys to pretend to be gender-matched scientists would affect their persistence during a challenging science activity. Your task is to emulate this sentence. For my experiment, I would simply write, specifically we explored if encouraging novices and healthcare professionals to be more empathetic would reduce racial bias in pain treatment decisions. So your job now, pause this video and do your own. Write your sentence, your method overview for your study. Now what you're doing is you're making a case that there is a gap. So that's what you're doing in this section of the paragraph that I want you to emulate. Let's go over the 3 points the authors are making. Prior work with adults suggests that women may benefit from in-group role models. Presenting STEM role models with whom women can identify effectively enhances their involvement in science. So those are good, right? Right? You can see that, women may benefit from in-group role models. STEM role models with whom women can identify effectively enhance science. Then you got the third one. This is like this is the actual making the case for the gap. Yet, women who view themselves as not sharing the characteristics of presented science role models are likely to veer away from science. So it's like role models are great, but not for all women, right? You see? So that's kind of like, hey, there's a gap. You know, there's a gap in the literature, and this is the gap. The gap is that women who do not identify with the role model will not show the benefits of taking on the identity of the role model. So you can see how I approach this in my paper. Research shows that real-world patients face biases. And while evidence from social psychology suggests interpersonal biases may be driving racial bias in medical decision-making, as interpersonal bias is common, many other scientists attribute these racial biases to racial discrimination in economics. I would actually alter my grammar there. I'm going to combine those last 2 sentences, but that's a minor point. What I did was I modeled the 3 sentences that were presented in front of me, and I really tried to make my case for the gap here, for like the issue. It's like, interpersonal biases may be driving racial biases in pain treatment, right? Like doctors may be racist. However, most other scientists don't believe me. It's kind of the same thing. It's like role models may work, yet not all women identify. So what you want to do is write your 3 sentences that end, or maybe more, you can add more, but write your sentences that you need that make a case that there's a gap in the literature. The whole point of this paragraph is making a case that there's a gap in the literature. So pause there and use evidence to make the case for a gap. Now, one thing I want to point out is look at the pattern. So when I'm talking about IV-DV population setting, let's see here. Prior work with population suggests that specific population may benefit, kind of a vague DV there, from in-group role models, IV. Presenting STEM role models, IV, with whom women population can identify, that's still part of the IV, effectively enhances their involvement in science, that's the DV, right? In that study. So when I say IV, DV, I'm not talking about your IV and DV. I'm talking about all the IVs and DVs that you are citing. Yet women population who view themselves as not sharing characteristics of the presented science role models, yet women who, have this specific characteristics. So I guess environment or personality descriptions go hand in hand. So women with this characteristic or women in this environment who are presented with the IV are likely to show this DV, which is veering away from science. Everything that I want you to describe should have an IV and a DV in it. Sometimes you have the population, sometimes you have the environment too, and sometimes you have a person characteristic. So keep that in mind. This is how we write in the field. This shortly, this quickly. Do the same. Now pause and make your case for your gap. Now this paragraph ends with the problem and the solution. Because this lack of identification, exposure to science role models on its own may not suffice to empower young girls in science. However, pretend play may help girls identify with the role model and thus realize the benefits of exposure. The problem and the solution. You see that? The problem, we don't know if women are going to identify, right? That's like the gap, right? The last one was the gap. This one could also be viewed by the gap, but really you see, look at this problem, solution. These two sentences go hand in hand. They are twins. They're best friends. You want them in your paper. Now, for my problem solution, it is impossible to know if racial disparities in the real world are caused by patient race and prejudice. However, true experiments that manipulate patient race will allow for one to examine if a manipulation of patient race causes disparities in pain treatment decisions and provides a laboratory model to propose and test solutions. This is a rough draft. I don't really like the way it sounds, but I'm there. Like, this would be an ANA paper in my class, and I'd edit it a little bit. I'm definitely going to edit this down a little bit later. I know that, it's like the racial bias of the participant that is responding to the different, patients of different races. But in a true experiment, what you're saying is that your manipulation of patient race causes healthcare professionals to be racially biased. That's real important. It's real important to demonstrate that race, right? Nothing outside. It's not all due to economics. One's race causes their healthcare professional to treat them more poorly. That's how I rephrase it, but I still want to use the cause in there. So, when you read it out loud, you can kind of hear what sucks. That's why my paper would get better, and that's why I'm picking up on typos as well. I'm going to leave them in there so you can see which typos I missed. But I want you to write the problem and solution, and you're going to end your gap paragraph. We're now writing the second paragraph of our intro in our writing backwards experiment here, and this is called the problem. You can read through it, but it's essentially like making an argument that, we need to intervene in gender differences in science at a much earlier age. So how they do this is, they point out that gender gaps emerge early, then they go through and they point out all this evidence that shows like this is a huge problem. So you got one really big, cool piece of evidence where they have multiple studies put together where they describe the IV and DV all together. They're talking about change studies. They do this in within subjects studies. So they describe two experiments, then they present a really nice big idea that's the author's. There's no citation for that. It's their great idea, right? You're supposed to have great ideas in papers. Then they provide another piece of evidence, then they provide a shocking piece of evidence, and then they got a nice big idea again. That's the outline of this paragraph. So now we have to emulate this paragraph, the problem paragraph. You can see what they wrote, pause it and read, but also you can see what I did. I talk about racial disparities are, omnipresent in nearly every aspect of American life, and disparities in medicine are common across numerous conditions. I would put, for example, here. For example, racial disparities exist in infant mortality, heart disease, and pain. However, simply documenting these disparities will not reduce them. Interventions are needed to end racist oppression I should probably put a comma there. And true experiments may provide a useful proving ground for discovering and implementing interventions. While structural solutions such as ending segregation appear decades, if not centuries away, targeting healthcare professionals' treatment decisions may prove a useful step to reducing racial biases experienced in the healthcare system. Furthermore, empathy is associated with better medical decision-making and outcomes for patients, and examining if known empathy interventions will improve helping in a laboratory analog of the real world is a worthwhile pursuit and is similar to how animal models help understand real-world problems. Should put a period there. I'd like to show you. First drafts are rough. When you read it out loud, you can see it. Period, capital, developing a laboratory analog of racial bias in medical decision-making may provide the testing ground needed to end these biases. End. Right? That's how I did it. Pause this video. Emulate this second paragraph, get your problem out there, and we will write the final paragraph next. So this first paragraph, its real job is to foreshadow the hypothesis and methods. If you look to the last sentence, it says, we propose that pretending to be a successful female scientist can increase girls' persistence and self-efficacy in science, nullifying gender gaps in early science engagement. That is their hypothesis and methods foreshadow. So that's really interesting. That's in there, and in an ideal world, that's all they would write. But we don't live in the ideal world. We have to break down this paragraph to really understand what's going on. So they start off with pretend play as a hallmark of child development. They don't cite it. They don't do anything. They're saying, hey, based on my reading of all of this, pretend play is a hallmark of child development, right? They're making this general statement. But you can't do that in science. So they make that statement, then they got to prove it correct. And that's what they're doing with all of this presentation of information. So they make a general statement about psychology, then they support it, right? And then finally they give their methods overview and hypothesis overview. So if you see this here currently... Sorry, my cat's going a little wild. It's okay, Rosie. We'll get you. But if you look at this currently, you'll just see what they're doing here. Pretend play is a hallmark of child development. Okay, that's an interesting statement. Let's support it. By donning the cape of a superhero, that's pretend play. The dress of a princess, pretend play. Or the lab coat of a scientist, pretend play. Right? Children temporarily disconnect from the present reality. That's a DV, not the DV in their study, but that's a DV to explore various possible selves. So now you're getting pretend play is allowing people to explore possible selves. So, if pretend play is a hallmark of child development, pretend play allows children to develop their selves. That's what's being said here. This transformation this transformation is referring to the transformation caused by pretend play. Not only allows children to learn about the social and physical world, but also promotes their cognitive functions and helps them cope in adverse contexts. All right? Those are the benefits, right? Pretend play allows children to learn about the social and physical world, promotes cognitive function, and helps them cope in adverse contexts. Am I in agreement with the idea that pretend play is a hallmark of child development? Yes, I am. So that's what they did. They made a general statement about psychology. They made a general statement about self, right? They made a general statement about the functions of pretend play, like a whole bunch of them, right? And so they supported that general statement. So they proved that general statement correct. Then in the next piece, the present study investigated whether pretend play can be used to empower children in the face of stereotyping and stigma, focusing on young girls in the domain of science and technology. If you notice, that might kind of help you understand, pretend play helps you deal with stress. You have pretend play may empower children in the face of stigma, focusing on young girls in the domains of science, right? So pretend play may help, because pretend play helps one deal with aversive context, it may help young girls deal with the aversive context of being stereotyped in STEM, right? I think that's just real interesting there, right? That sentence, right? The present study investigated whether pretend play can be used to empower children in the face of stereotyping and stigma, right? That's That's the general hypothesis, and then you got the methods overview right after it. So let's just go over what you got to do. Make a general statement about psychology. Prove it correct, right? Make a statement about your hypothesis. The present study investigated whether pretend play, so forth. You want that to be linked to how the data was presented. If you look at their hypothesis, it comes right after they talk about pretend play can help with stigma. Well, they're talking about a situation where folks are stigmatized, right? So that's their hypothesis, and their methods overview is presented right there. There is a rule in writing academic papers in psychology. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them. This is where we tell them what we're going to tell them. We're going to tell the reader that the present study investigated whether pretend play can be used to empower children in the face of stereotyping and stigma, right? And we propose that pretending to be a successful female scientist can do all these great things. You need to do the same. All right, so now we're in it. Now we have to make this happen. The most important two pieces are my hypothesis overview, my methods overview. Those are the last two sentences. I wrote those first when I was writing mine. I do sometimes like to write things in reverse, right? That just makes sure I'm trained. What I did was, where did I start? Instead of pretend play as a hallmark of child development, I just started and said, hey, America's racist, and I proved my point. So I added evidence to that first statement. Then I even talk more about that. I'm like, oh, America is a racist place, and this even goes to medicine. Well, discrimination in medicine exists as well. Here's my evidence for that. Then finally, like their thing where they're going to pretend play to deal with stressful situations, I'm going to empathy to deal with racism, right? This is actually the only place in the paper I talk about empathy and why it matters. So I've covered my bases here, but I've talked about like empathy is a way to reduce racist responses and may be a useful intervention. You know, if I didn't, the one thing I don't like about my intro is that I don't talk about empathy more. I might just give it one more paragraph and talk about why empathy in medicine is important. I would do that maybe next in my paper after this paragraph. But that's just me saying, hey, I'd like to cover this a little bit more. That's okay, but that's not your goal. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to get through writing this paper because I want you to be finished. So here's how you finish. Right? This is how I finished it. Then I presented, like I said earlier, my hypothesis and methods overview. That is the whole point of this paragraph. That's what I'm looking for. So now I need you to pause this, and you're going to start. You're going to write your hypothesis overview, your method overview, and you're going to use some evidence to talk about a general phenomenon in psychology. Humans are racist. To go to a specific phenomenon in psychology. For my example, it was like, it's kind of complicated, but for my example, there's racism in medicine. Empathy may reduce it. For your example, pretend play impacts self, and finally may reduce aversive, stigmatizing situations. Right? Use the model. Write your versions. Look at how we write. Look, I'm going to point this out one more time. By donning the cape of a superhero, and actually I'm gonna go to this one. This transformation caused by pretend play. So not only this IV, right? It's implied, but this transformation of pretend play, not only, that's a cool move, allows children to learn about the social and physical world, DV1, but also promotes their cognitive functions, DV2, and helps them cope in aversive context, DV3, right? When we write about research, there's only a few things you have to consider. Number one, that sentence better have the IV and the DV. Even though this sentence, the IV is kind of implied, it's easy for me to figure out. This transformation is a direct reference to the IV. The DVs are all those results listed there. All right? So I think that's great. Sometimes you talk about who the participants are, children. Sometimes you talk about what situation they're in. In this case, they don't, but you could say like education. And sometimes you talk about who the participant is. As a social psychologist, I don't really deal with those personality descriptions too much, but you might in your research. So if you have a this research works in this situation for whom, right? For what personality type, extroversion, so forth, you might find this very useful. But what I need you to do right now, methods, hypothesis, overview, and give us some general statement about psychology that you're going to support that leads to and is connected with your methods and hypothesis overview. You can see what I did here. If you follow their lead, you're going to be just fine. Now, back in the day, this was so common, but I thought it went out of fashion. I'm wrong. It came back. In social psychology, particularly, we liked to start our papers with quotes or examples or that. This one starts with a quote, and so I Googled and I found a quote for mine, right? This is the quote I'm going to use. And I think it's fun. It's a good way to start a paper, but you got to make sure it really fits. This one really fits my research. So racism is not merely a simplistic hatred. It is more often broad sympathy towards some and broader skepticism towards others. Love it, right? Sympathy, empathy are definitely related. Not the same thing, but we're not going to get into that. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is amazing, right? I love this dude. So I get to represent someone's work that I really like. You can choose quotes from Lit. You can choose... I don't even care if you choose a quote from the Lego TV show that I watch all the time. It's up to you and your project and all that. But this is a beautiful way to start a paper. It's a beautiful way to engage individuals in your work and all that. Now, the one thing is you've written this paper backwards. Why did you do that? Because our goal is last, right? You state that hypothesis and methods overview last, and then every other section is making sure you build that specific idea. This paper is the GAP style paper, right? So you start, where did we start? We started with the methods and hypothesis foreshadowing, right? That's where we were. Then we went to the problem. Then we went to the gap. Then we went to our solution, right? That's the justification for our hypothesis. Then we went to, our methods overview. You can see every place we went. And if you write your paper this way and you keep focusing on the methods, right? The methods and hypotheses, your paper is going to make sense. Now, there are things about this that, you may look at it at the end and say, I'd like to add a paragraph. I'd probably add an extra paragraph about empathy to this for mine. That's totally fine. But I'm showing you that this is a published paper in the top journal in our field. Right? Psych Science. It is the top journal in the field of psychology, in my opinion. Maybe it's losing some of its luster from 10 years ago or whatever. Some people don't like it, but it is still one of the most highly cited, highly read journals in the field of psychology. And this is the top of the top. And all I did, and all I'm trying to teach you here, is to take models and write like them. So with this, a couple hours... You'll have an intro done. That's an A in my class. After I edit it, you'll have an intro that I think is worthy of an undergraduate journal. After we edit it a few times, I think it'd be worthy of a journal like Psych Science if we have good data. So that's how you write an intro, friends. And you see every step I went through. I did mine. One thing that, I'll show you this later, but I think that's a really interesting lesson. Another lesson from here. I'm reading it out loud, right? I caught all my typos. Read your papers out loud. I know it's embarrassing. Find a quiet room and do it. You'll find everything, okay? I left my typos in here for you to see them, to see I'm not perfect. It doesn't bother me. But if you make fun of me for my typos and you're not a friend, I've had students oh, you made a typo. And I'm and yeah, that's part of who I am, So keep that in mind. But you can always fix that stuff. But now we have an intro written the way the pros write it. And the one thing I want to say is I don't know, ignore everything your high school teachers taught you or whatever. People come at me with, I heard this rule and that rule. I've seen one sentence paragraphs. I've seen very few things cited, but a lot of logic and examples and ideas. It's essentially, there's a lot of freedom in this. So don't view everything as a strict rule. But at the same time, follow that structure, Hypothesis, methods, foreshadowing. That's step number one. What's the big problem? Step number 2. What's the gap in the lit? That's step number 3. How am I going to fill that gap? What's the argument for my hypothesis? Step number 4. And then methods overview. But if you work on this, you'll have a paper. Okay, so that's it. This guide will help you get a good paper. All right. This is the intro one. So methods is next, results is coming, and we'll get there. All right. The intro is the hardest part though. So once you finish this, other things are easy.